Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. I've been struggling a bit this summer to get through my must-do list each day. And to be honest, BookTube is not on that list. BookTube is my treat, not a responsibility. And I don't want to make it start becoming one at a time when I'm somewhat overwhelmed with other work. On the other hand, I love thinking about and making videos, and I love reading your comments. So I'm really pleased that I have a bit more open time today. So I thought I might talk about my reading plans for August. I want to participate in a couple of themed group reads, and I also have a personal tangent project that I'll talk about afterwards. First, an interesting group of booktubers is getting together to read some T.S. Eliot. I have breezed through some of Eliot's poems, always without making much sense of them, but loving the sound. But I've never read his work particularly seriously. I'm so excited to read with the large and thoughtful group. This is why we read as part of a group. We've gathered around the leadership of Thomas at the channel Art and Lit Matters, Roy and Dr. Jenny from the channel Roy Reads Anything, Angelia at Read and Reread, and a whole gang of thoughtful readers who I will list below in the comments. It should be a great experience to read together with this diverse group, diverse in experience with Eliot as well as in attitudes towards him. I know some of the people on this list adore Eliot, and some are far, far more, well, let's say skeptical. We'll be focusing on some of the poet's best-known works, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, his 4 quartets, old Possum's book, Practical Cats, and the Wasteland. And of course, we'd absolutely love to have you join us. I'll leave a link in the description box. The other big group read I want to participate in during August is one of the events I felt connected to even before I started a channel, and that is Faulkner in August, initially started by Alan at Big Hard Books and Classics and Brian at Bookish. In 2025, there are far more hosts and participants from far and wide, some of whom I'll name down in the description box. I mentioned earlier that reading with other people can be especially useful with a writer with a complex style, especially if you have some readers in your group who already have some experience with that author. And to be honest, T.S. Eliot and William Faulkner might have to compete for that moniker. Few authors make more sense to read with other people than Eliot and Faulkner. Faulkner's work is both traditional, shaped heavily by Southern folklore, and at the same time, distinctly modernist. He can be pretty baffling sometimes, for either reason. We would love to have you join us this year, whether you're brand new to Faulkner or already a Faulknerian. The discussion will be on Voxer, and if you'd like to join, you can send me a Voxer message, and I'll be happy to add you to the group. I'll leave my Voxer handle below. The 2025 choice is easier than some of Faulkner's books. Go Down Moses, published in 1942, is a collection of connected shorter works. Essentially, this collection helps us understand a diverse group of related people that Faulkner creates as a way of talking about the continuity and the differences between antebellum and postbellum Southern culture, perhaps especially the way racism and racial identity functioned during those years. Just an aside, my father knew an older professor who taught at a time when it was unusual for American students to get much of a classical education in their high schools, even at most fancy prep schools. They did, however, learn the basics of American political history almost always. One student in this professor's college-level American history class raised her hand during the first lecture and asked what the professor meant when he referred to the antebellum period. The professor started to splutter out a condemnation of her preparation, and she quickly cut him off, explaining that her fluency in Latin allowed her to understand that he was talking about a time before the war, but she didn't know which war it referred to in the United States. Did he mean the Revolution, the Civil War, perhaps the First World War? The student had been raised in the UK, and she'd been taught the history of a different nation. So, for those of you who don't know the American meanings of antebellum and postbellum, the first refers roughly to the 4 or 5 decades before the Civil War, a period characterized by plantation agriculture and chattel slavery in the southern states, while the North was increasingly separating itself from slavery, with more focus on industrial development, as well as a somewhat more limited spread of abolitionist thought. In short, the antebellum period is when the North and the South were increasingly growing apart. And the postbellum period, after the Civil War, was when the system of slavery was ending, but new forms of violent racial control, or white supremacy, were developing in its stead, control that in most cases was held in the hands of the same elite whites who had been in power during the antebellum period. Well, that was a rather drawn-out explanation there. At any rate, in Faulkner's Go Down Moses, we have the story of the particular group of characters that highlight the relationships between Southern whites and Southern blacks before and after the Civil War, and the book draws out how divided they were, but also how connected. I haven't read this book in probably 2 decades. My memory is that I was fairly surprised by how seriously Faulkner tried to portray some of the intense racism that was at the heart of Southern history. As a historian, I usually find it natural to approach literature historically, that is, produced in a particular context, like in this case, the culture of racism in which Faulkner was raised. I don't usually feel a need to harp on the fact that Faulkner's racism and sexism shows in his writing, especially when he seems to be thinking in somewhat more open and compassionate ways about the black characters he writes than we might expect from a white Southern writer of his generation. And we also see moments when Faulkner highlights how cruel and vicious the Southern racial system and gender system could be. Nevertheless, I do have kind of a complicated history with William Faulkner. Some of his books I find tremendously distasteful. And then there is the first Faulkner I ever read, one of the stories in this book, an abridged version of The Bear, one in a high school textbook my mother used to teach from, an abridgment that stripped out all of the complicated discussion of the impacts of the South's racial history and preserved only the hunting adventure of a bunch of rowdy male characters. You may not be shocked to learn that high school me really had no interest in reading about hunting adventures. It took me a long time to pick up another work of Faulkner's, and it totally transformed my evaluation of him as a writer. That book was Light in August, and I feel the same way about the novels The Sound and the Fury, and Absalom, Absalom, and a few others. I'm eager to see if Go Down Moses might fit into my highlights list on this reading. While I'm reading these stories, I hope to at least dip into an analysis of Go Down Moses, a work by the scholar Thadious Davis called Games of Property, Law, Race, Gender, and Faulkner's Go Down Moses. This is an academic book, beautifully written, but definitely assuming readers have some background knowledge, as well as a little patience for a fairly academic style of argumentation. Let me read a passage from the back cover. The author argues that in unrelenting attention to issues related to ownership of land and people, Go Down Moses ranks among Faulkner's finest and most accomplished works. This is not a common claim. The quote continues, bringing together law, social history, game theory, and feminist critiques, she shows that the book is unified by games, fox hunting, gambling with cards and dice, racing, and, like the law, games are rule-dependent forms of social control and commentary. She illuminates that dual focus in Go Down Moses on property and ownership on the one hand, and on masculine sport and social ritual on the other. This book sounds absolutely fascinating. Finally, I want to mention a personal project that I have done informally and sort of half-heartedly since I started participating in Faulkner in August. Each August, I've tried to read a work or sometimes several works of Southern fiction by other writers. I haven't given my little project a name before, but I think I will this time. August. You are absolutely free to join me in the project, of course. Anything about the South or written by a Southerner in any time period. But I'm not organizing anything official this year. Maybe next time. If you might be interested in making this into a thing in 2026, let me know down in the comments. In just a second, I'll get to the literature about the South that I want to talk about this month. But first, let me tell you two other Southern literary things. First, I'm going to be choosing a Southern writer to be the focus for Hannah's Bookaka this year. For those of you who don't know, Hannah's Bookaka is an 8-day posting fiesta, which is my Jewish and laid-back version of the 25-day Vlogmas. Anyway, my goal is to post every day during Hanukkah, only 8 days, and at least most of the posts this year will be about a particular Southern author. I did something kind of similar 2 years ago for Hannah's Bookaka when I talked your ears off about Willa Cather. I'm thinking the focus this time will be on Eudora Welty. Welty is one of my favorite authors and has been since I was young, and I have more books by and about her on my shelf than I can read in 8 days. The other piece of news in Southern literature is that Harper Lee, author of To Kill a Mockingbird, is coming out with a new book. No, it isn't new, of course, but it will be published for the very first time. The title is The Land of Sweet Forever, and it's a collection of stories and essays planned for release in late October. If I can find a way to squeeze her in between all the Victorian literature I hope to read in October, I definitely will. Otherwise, the new book, as well as maybe both of her earlier novels, and maybe a biography too, will be on my list in November, I think. But for this month, I want to reread and finally make a video about a pair of books I've been intending to discuss for some time. Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and Percival Everett's James, which I'm sure you know is a retelling of Twain's book from the perspective of the enslaved man Twain calls Jim. I've been playing over these two books in my head ever since I received an early reader's copy of Percival Everett's book, but I still haven't actually made a video, and it is about time. So these will be my two books for this year's August. All right. I can't wait to dive into these books. Just a warning, I do have a happy little interruption that might keep me from making videos for a part of August. A friend of mine, actually my former co-writer, and I have planned a writing retreat for a couple of weeks in August. I'm really looking forward to trying to shelve all the responsibilities I've had for the past several months and instead devote a lot more time to a particular writing project. During that period, I might only choose to check in by occasional community notes on BookTube and Voxer and Discord, but I will be back, eager to tell you more about my reading and to hear about yours. Thanks for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.